So nearly 3 years after the Brexit referendum and 3 days before Britain was supposed to leave the EU, it still remains unclear how, when or even if Brexit will happen. And a new opinion poll suggests that Brexit Remainers and Leavers are increasingly concerned about the way the UK government has handled the process. From Westminster, we're joined now by our correspondent Tyke and Wright. Good morning, Tyke. How unusual is this move from MPs to seize control of the parliamentary agenda?
Georgia, hello to you. It is highly unusual. It hasn't happened in the 100 years or so since the government has actually had the power to kind of set the agenda in the House of Commons. And what's also unusual about it all is that here you have a backbench MP able to command a majority in this House of Commons at a time when the Prime Minister, that has eluded her for several months now. So what does that mean from here? Well, we know that the series of votes, indicative votes, is going to start tomorrow. And already Parliament has indicated that it would not support a no-deal outcome. It will resist that at all costs. And equally, it's widely expected that this could lead to a softer Brexit, given that it has already ruled out Theresa May's withdrawal agreement on 2 occasions. So Theresa May has said that she does not oblige to follow what Parliament says tomorrow night. These votes will not be legally binding, although at a time when a majority has eluded her, it'll be difficult for her to ignore what a majority in Parliament does ultimately go for. You mentioned there that opinion poll, and it does make for interesting reading. 80% of Leavers and 85% of Remainers think that this government has handled these negotiations badly, and there is growing gloom among Leavers about the economic prospects for a Brexit Britain, although interestingly support for Remain, were there to be a second referendum as measured by this poll, just 54%, so not a thumping majority there. It was carried out by the National Centre for Social Research, and one of Britain's most celebrated pollsters, John Curtis, was behind it. John, thank you very much for joining us on Euronews. It is interesting that the one thing that unites both sides of the Brexit divide right now is their despair at how the government's handled the negotiations.
Indeed, I think perhaps it's quite truly remarkable that on a subject on which, for the most part, Remainers and Leavers tend to be polarised and take very different views, Theresa May has managed to unite them. The only trouble is she's managed to unite them in opposition to her deal and with criticism of the way in which the Brexit negotiations have been handled. Now, that said, of course, the reason as to why Remainers and Leavers are critical of the deal is somewhat different from each other. So we find, for example, that around 70% of those who voted Remain say, well, the problem with this deal is it would mean we'd have too distant a relationship with the European Union. Leave voters, in contrast, are inclined to the criticism that it would mean we'd have too close a relationship. So here's perhaps an indication of why Brexit is so difficult for the UK to resolve, because at the end of the day, is always a risk that Remain voters will say, look, frankly, this is not good enough because we prefer to remain. And Leave voters go, frankly, this isn't good enough, we prefer a harder Brexit. And Mrs May has found herself being crucified by that polarisation of opinion.
John, what do the numbers tell you about the growing gloom or the shifting opinions among Brexiteers about Britain's economic prospects after Brexit?
Well, it's worth bearing in mind we were never that optimistic about the economic consequences of Brexit, and even during the referendum, there were more of us who said that the economy is going to suffer as a result of leaving the EU than thinking we'd be better off. The truth is, quite a lot of people who voted Leave said, look, it just won't make any difference. What is true, however, it's not dramatic, but it's been something like a 17-point increase during the course of the last 2 years in the proportion of Leave voters who think that the economy is going to be worse off. That said, there's still more Leave voters think we're going to be better off than worse off, but they're not as confident as they once were as a group. And crucially, when it comes to the fact that the polls now tend to show a narrow Remain lead, and they tend to show the Leave vote perhaps being a little less loyal than the Remain vote. It's not actually those rather dramatic figures about what people think about the deal, i.e. failure to implement the principle of Brexit is not what's putting some Leave voters off. It is concern about the consequences economically. That, in the end, is perhaps much more important.
Finally, John, with the greatest respect to your art, pollsters have got it wrong on several occasions, not just in this country but in other countries, and ultimately democracy produced a very different result to what we're expecting. Why should we believe what your poll has told us on this occasion?
Well, I mean, I think I take the point as read. And given that the polls are saying that the position is quite narrow, and given also that the polls, including our research, are confirming that actually one of the key reasons as to why we seem to have a narrow Remain lead in the polls is because those who did not vote 2.5 years ago are now clearly pro-Remain. That's all good reason to say, look, basically it's close. But on the one hand, we can no longer presume, the weight of the evidence is one that we can no longer presume that we're in favour of leaving, but equally we might not vote to Remain if we were to have a second referendum.
OK, John Curtis from the National Centre for Social Research, thank you very much for joining us. Well, whatever about the public thinks, we'll get a better idea about what parliamentarians think when those indicative votes begin tomorrow. Although one thing to bear in mind, it does not mean that Theresa May's withdrawal agreement has gone away. It could still yet come back for another vote. And one thing that I think this move towards indicative votes could mean is that those hard Brexiteers who thought they could hold out for something even harder might come to realise that the withdrawal agreement is as hard as Brexit might get.